Okay, so I'm going to begin, and we're going to conclude That Hideous Strength which is sort of sad to me because I never like to leave Lewis behind, but then we get to look forward to moving on to Tolkien. So hardly can be too upset about that. I wanted to mention, before I get into it, a couple of books which I think you might find interesting or helpful. This one by John Gray, 7 Types of Atheism. An interesting book. I heard it mentioned in a podcast I listened to a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I don't even remember now. But in the third chapter, he talks about science as a religion and a certain type of atheism which he encounters there. And it's really interesting because he focuses on a type of atheism that nonetheless has the features of a religion. And he cites C.S. Lewis in this, interestingly, as a critique of this type of atheism. And it's interesting to hear somebody who purports to be an atheist citing C.S. Lewis on this, and specifically the sort of evolutionary optimism that will lead to the abolition of man, as he called it. And I've been talking about this in my course for several years now. It's interesting to hear an atheist come to the same conclusion. I think it's a rational conclusion. I've never thought it was the perspective of somebody who's a Christian. I just think that he's observing something that is rationally observable, as is something called posthumanism. So Ray Kurzweil, in his book on the singularity, is also going to talk about humans transcending their biological nature. And that's one of the things that I think marks the whole gender discussion of gender identity and so forth, is not the gender identity per se, but a push by the tech companies and the scientific community that wants to move beyond human nature. And this is a category to break the consensus on human identity. So it's a political wedge, if you will, to push through the natural defense of a biological sense of human nature. And on that front, if you want a book that collects a whole variety of scholarly perspectives, I recommend this book, edited by John G. West, called The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism, and Society. A whole series of essays, some of which relate to this topic of the abolition of man. But again, the reference to The Magician's Twin is taken here directly from the abolition of man and The Magician's Bargain. And I think I talked about that in last class, citing this passage here. And he notes, and I again repeat myself, there's something which unites magic and applied sciences while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science, alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. So it's very different. It's not different, it is opposed. It's actually hostile to the old view of the humanities, and that's Lewis's point in The Abolition of Man, from which I'm citing, is that there is a new and very powerful opponent to not just the humanities, but to human nature in the discussions that are happening in academic departments all over the place, or maybe even not happening. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. That's exactly what happens, of course, in this book, where Merlin is disinterred. Right? They're digging up. Same with Frankenstein. Again, when I teach the sci-fi course, I did mention Frankenstein. We could, and I talked about how it's prophetic about the way modern science will push itself. and the direction, the trajectory. It's already apparent in the 18th century. I say that, and actually Gray himself mentions it, very interestingly. Let me say a little bit more about that, because it might surprise you a little bit. I talked about Herbert Spencer, whose term it is the survival of the fittest. He's a Darwinist, and others, but also even you can find the idea of ranking humanity into hierarchies even before Darwin. So David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, said that the Negroes were different and inferior to a Caucasian people. Funny thing, you don't expect it from a philosopher. Immanuel Kant, again considered to be the great Enlightenment philosopher, even greater than Hume by some, claims that no African had ever added anything to the world by way of art or intellectual innovation. Voltaire, the French, so now we've dealt with a Scot, a German. The Frenchman Voltaire calls the Jews a small, ignorant, crude people who made usury a sacred duty. They're all atheists, by the way. And Kant, Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, makes father of atheistic positivism, founds a religion of humanity. And that's what we're encountering here. So Lewis comments in the work Mere Christianity that he's not going to deal with the atheists because he doesn't think that they're worthy of consideration, but he does deal with those that he calls pantheists. These are the real threat, and amongst the pantheists, those that will believe in the religion of humanity are probably the most virulent in our day, under different auspices, whether it's identity politics or transhumanist motives or post-humanist environmentalism. It's all there. Now, I just find that really interesting. And again, Lewis is directly speaking against these movements, even while they seem very contemporary, or at least they are in the public's mind. So what's interesting to me is that what Lewis talks about in his fiction now seems like a commentary on politics by Lewis. And it's not. It's there. He's reading it in the journals. It's there in the scholarly debates that he hears over sherry and so forth. You know, we're talking in the back rooms. He's hearing what the intellectuals have to say about this, but it's not actually an explicit political agenda. Well, in That Hideous Strength, it is becoming one, and it's through the institutes of the NICE and so forth. And their aim is actually to not only to abolish man, but to gain control over human nature. And they're going to do that by disinterring a body, in this case Merlin, and use the same thing that he has power over, mainly a sort of magic, but to use it for a different purpose. Now here again he cites, if we compare the chief trumpeter of the new era, Bacon, a sort of power over nature. That's the aim of science. And Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, the similarity is striking. You will read in some critics that Faustus has a thirst for knowledge. In reality, he hardly even mentions it. He doesn't want knowledge. He wants power. It's not truth he wants from the devils, but gold and guns and girls. Who else wants gold and guns and girls? Divine, right? Who wants gold and guns and girls? James Bond. I mean, everybody, right? Of the modern gold, guns, girls. Sure, it sounds good. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. There you go. That's the motivation. All things that move between the quiet poles shall be at his command, and a sound magician is a mighty God. And he condemns those who want knowledge as an end in itself. Lewis recommends knowledge as an end in itself. Well, actually, he doesn't recommend it as an end in itself, but as a way of knowing God. Right? So it's a different motivation for knowledge. He wants it as a consequence. He's a consequentialist. And again, Comtean positivism, again, is going to talk about things in terms of probabilities. We're going to do things for the greatest possible gain for the greatest number of people, and we're going to ignore human individual nature. So an individual nature is of a rational nature. That distinguishes human beings from all other natures besides the spirits. Animals don't have minds. Animals don't have reason. And animals are not individuals. They're members of species or herds or groups. Lewis is, in other words, while talking about, in the context of a fiction novel, talking about politics as it's playing out in our day. That's, I think. Let me go back to the novel. Oops. There we go.